Welcome back. I'm Alfred Lambremont Weber, and I'm with Kevin Trimmel, who is a secret space program abductee who has memories and has served on Mars, and who is here today to discuss and both his service, to share that with us, and also to discuss the upcoming program to be presented at the Mars Anomaly Research Society 7th annual meeting. It is time for Mars Anomaly Research Society to sue for life on Mars disclosure in U.S. federal court or other venue. And this would be not only Mars, the nonprofit organization, Washington State nonprofit organization that U.S. chrononaut and Mars explorer Andrew DiBisciago and myself, Alfred Lambremont Weber, founded, and he's the president and founder, and I'm the chairman of the board of advisors. But also all of the and whatever of the Mars whistleblowers and other Mars explorers and secret space program member and Mars Explorers Kevin Trimmel, we've just consulted prior to the program, has indicated that he is open once there is pro bono counsel brought on to join this project as it moves forward, and as we'll go through here and explain exactly what the project is. But first, let me go back to basics and say, Kevin, welcome to the program. And thank you for so graciously agreeing to take this kind of, I think, very realistic and practical step. Well, now that we're coming forward, now that many of the Mars whistleblowers have come forward, what are we going to do about it? And first of all, could you please describe for the audience your service in the secret space program, what that means? You said you're an abductee, and what exactly was your service on Mars, and when did that take place, just to get it on the record? Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Alfred. So my background involving the secret space program starts in November of 2008. On November 12th, I was bicycling in a forest close to where I live in Cambridge, Ontario. And it was about 3:30 in the afternoon on a sun and cloud day. And I took a break on my bicycle and was drinking some water, having a break. And then all of a sudden, the sky went dark. And I thought a cloud had blown overhead and blocked out the sun. And when I looked up, right above me, above the treetops, was a white triangular shaped craft that people would know as a TR3, except this was a scaled down version of that. It wasn't the black triangle most people are familiar with. It was a smaller version of that. It was white. It had paneling on it, and so I feel it was man-made. And it was hovering above the treetops, and I was able to walk underneath it for 5 minutes. It was actually moving at a walking pace. So I walked my bicycle along the trail, and when I got to this field, it started to rise up into the air, and that's when it actually picked me up. And I call it blinking in and out, because I looked up at it as it was rising into the air, and as fast as you can blink, the next thing you know, I was on the craft. There was really no realization of it, aside from some nausea and dizziness, actually blinking and finding myself aboard the craft. Now, in order to keep the introduction brief, I'm not going to get into my whole timeline here. I just wanted to state for the record that that's when they initially picked me up, and that's where my experience began on November 12th, 2008, at approximately 3:30 in the afternoon in Cambridge, Ontario, Canada. And what would later happen is I was actually taken to a base in the Arctic first. and then I was taken to a moon base for orientation. The Arctic base appeared to be more of a medical checkup, and also a way station before going to orientation at a moon base, which I can go into more detail later on about what happened there. But then after orientation at the moon base, that's where Mars came into the picture, because I found out that I was actually abducted by a branch of the Solar Warden Navy secret space program. But these were the British Commonwealth allies of the American secret space Navy program, the British Commonwealth being the #1 ally of the United States. So the Canadian forces were offering logistical support and serving in an auxiliary capacity in conjunction with the Solar Warden program. And what happened at the moon base after orientation, it was explained to us that they had actually facilitated their training to an existing Mars colony that were responsible for training their personnel beyond the point of basic orientation. And the skills they taught us had to do with everything from basic like boot camp in terms of physical training, but then they got into things like Qigong training and Qigong swimming lessons in underground pools below the Mars surface. There were these huge underground lakes and pools, and they would have us jump in the water and do Qigong in the water with an instructor that would stand on the edge of the pool and would telepathically communicate to us basically exactly what you do normally when you do Tai Chi and different energy work practices physically. But the next step was they wanted us to do it in the water, because I guess it acted almost like fluidic space. Being in the water, you could actually create like an energy bubble, and with your movements, it would actually kind of simulate actually working in fluidic space with energy. And so that's where my experience on Mars comes into the picture, because there wasn't just the Qigong swimming lessons. As bizarre as it sounds, after the swimming lessons and basic fitness training, we got shipped over to another faction on Mars, and this was the Templars, which I know sounds pretty strange, like that there would be a Templar secret society presence at a Mars colony. And that's where they taught us remote viewing. And it was actually the Templars teaching us remote viewing. And they even took it a step further after the basic SRV practices that most people are familiar with. The last unit was a form of synthetic remote viewing, where they actually were hooking us up to drones and using drones in a remote viewing capacity, which I can get more into detail later about how to actually fly a drone with your mind. And I guess the remote viewing was kind of a prereq for this kind of drone flying, which is like a synthetic form of basic remote viewing, when you're actually flying a small micro drone with your mind, and they're able to do double checks, because if they could have an actual remote viewer doing the traditional practice, they could double check it with these kinds of drones that can see through most surfaces. They can look straight through walls. They can look through people with these drones. So they can double check their answers, testing SRV, standard or scientific remote viewing rather, with this synthetic form of remote viewing. So the training that happened on Mars, it was bizarre, and it got even more and more bizarre as the training progressed. And I'm not going to get into that right now, but then there was some bad memories that I try to suppress, where they, when they would hand us over to like the Templars and these secret societies on Mars, there was some bizarre, what people would think of as like SRA type stuff as well, having to do with drugs and kind of more ritualistic kind of ceremonies, that I try to block that out. And I also want to kind of stay on point here as well and not go off on on tangents. But is that an okay introduction?
Yeah, yeah. So you really would have standing then uh, uh, to uh, to go forward uh, in in any action because you are and have been part of as you said, a U.S. Secret Solar Warden, U.S. Navy components, Solar Warden project, secret space program, the British Commonwealth component of it, the Canadian forces. Now, were you a civilian that was abducted, that was kind of impressed, that was kind of shanghaied, or are you a member of the Canadian Defense Forces?
I would be considered a civilian psychic asset that was abducted. Although when I did some research into my family background, I do come from a World War II Navy family. My great uncle Bill served in World War II as a communications officer, and he made it to the rank of lieutenant. And for his service, he became a third-degree Freemason after the war. I have his war medals and his rings and pictures of him meeting with the Admiralty. And he also served in Korea as well on a destroyer. So he was part of the bridge crew as a lieutenant. So I do come from a World War II Navy family. I thought that was interesting because that's the faction that ended up abducting me, being his great nephew.
Right, but from a legal standpoint, if I look at it as a judge, I'm a judge on the Kuala Lumpur War Crimes Tribunal, formerly, and a former adjunct professor at the University of Texas on the Bill of Rights, um, and I would see it, and as well as an international lawyer, I would see that. I mean, back in the old days, they would say that you were shanghaied onto a ship. You were
Right.
impressed. They used to go to the bars and they grab able-bodied seamen and impress them. So in this case, they used extraterrestrial technology and beamed you up to the ship, Scotty. Is that basically what they did?
Uh, their argument was, and this is actually a good thing to run by you with your legal background. Their argument was, according to Masonic law, I was the next in line, being the next male heir, because I do have an older cousin who's female. And after my uncle Bill passed away, I inherited his Mason rings. Now, I'm not a Mason myself. I consider myself just a caretaker and a steward of his Masonic rings. So their argument was in like this Masonic medieval tradition that I was the next in line as the next male heir to my uncle Bill, so that it was so there's like a soul contract um, involving Masonic law from their perspective, and that was their argument, that it was my responsibility to carry on the tradition.
Right, but you did not have what's necessary in the law, which is informed consent.
That's a very good point. They told us like we're on a need to know basis, and it was more like a kidnapping situation where um, they have all the power. You've been basically pulled out of your reality, and you're and also too, once you go to the moon and when you go to the and to Mars, um, that's outside of like what laws, what charter of rights. There is no charter of rights or laws on Mars or even the moon for that matter. It's all Earth-based law in terms of our standard you know judicial system. So they were outside of the law. It was almost like the Wild West, where there really is no law. It's just the rule of like might is right. So whoever has like basically at gunpoint, like the Wild West, whoever has the guns um, has the power, and they rule the like a Wild West town kind of thing. So it was a very much a lawless type of situation where they had all the power because they had the military personnel and security personnel that were holding you at gunpoint, and they used drugs and they beam frequencies at you. There's a mind control aspect where they slowly make you into a mind controlled slave, And as they program you to be a part of the program, all the pre-programming, you end up becoming very complacent, and you kind of it's almost like what they did in the concentration camps with mass fluoride poisoning, where you lose the incentive to want to escape. It seems impossible, especially if you find yourself locked in a facility on the moon or underground on Mars, and there's really no hope of escape, and they have all the power. So yeah, you lose the incentive to escape. And just to add, then there's another component is because I was put into a communications program as an ET interface. That was the point of the training. I eventually had to interface with various types of ETs. And something really strange that I didn't expect at first was, I mean, they try to prep you as much as possible, but your physical body, in terms of the intelligence of the body, once you are face to face with an ET for the first time physically, there's this visceral response because your body knows that this organism did not evolve in your ecosystem. So the body freaks out, and it is a fight or flight response. And so when I got my first take of an ET, I turned away from it and started freaking out. And what's interesting is then the Stockholm syndrome kind of comes into play, because even though you're being held against your will at gunpoint and they're drugging you, they're still your human brothers and sisters and human family. And once you start interacting with ETs, then you actually get the Stockholm syndrome, where you're actually grateful to have human spotters around you instead of actually being alone with these beings, because the beings that our governments are in contact with are not benevolent beings whatsoever. They're extremely nasty.
Could you state, I, I just I just want to mark for the record that I want to go back later to the 1967 Outer Space Treaty and the Moon Treaty, both of which apply to law, the presence of law on Mars, and the presence of law on the Moon, and the presence of law in the solar system. So that what you were told is absolutely false. What you were told by the U.S. Navy is false. And I was asked by Oxford University Press, which is a division of Oxford University, to write a book on extraterrestrials and the law. And so my book, The Omniverse, grew out of this request. And so these matters have been considered. And in fact, at the law school at which I graduated, Professor Myers McDougall taught a whole course on the law of outer space. So the U.S. Navy is in error and is attempting to pull a fast one. And in fact, we found the Bush administration, George W. Bush, Richard B. Cheney, who flunked out of my class at Yale University in his sophomore year, and Alberto Gonzales, their Attorney General, guilty of war crimes for attempting to circumvent the Geneva Conventions against war crimes against civilians, so that we actually found the US government guilty of criminal conspiracy to circumvent international law, and that includes the law of space on Mars and the law of space on the moon. So, sir, as a Canadian citizen and a member of the British Commonwealth, you were sorely misinvolved, and in my judgment, you have cause of action against the U.S. Navy and the U.S. government for war crimes and for damages as well. That's just a side. But I'd like to come back. What exophenotype, meaning what kind of ETs were these? What were they, like reptilian, human? The ones that the U.S. that are nasty, you say?
On Mars, there was a raptor type being that looked a lot like what you see in Jurassic Park, with a couple subtle differences. Kind of larger eyes, more, its arms were longer, almost like human type arms, 3 fingers, but longer human type arms. And it was completely telepathic. It walked into the room. Just to backtrack on this, this one of my first experiences with like an ET interface type experience. I was in this break room, and it looked like a regular break room with a countertop and 4 round tables set up with chairs. And over the intercom, they said, "The being will be with you shortly." And I thought they meant a human being. And all of a sudden, this raptor being walks in, and I instinctively, as ridiculous as it sounds, I jumped up onto the countertop. And that's what I mean about the body reacting before the mind, the interpreter, can think. The body already was doing its own flight response. And so I jumped up onto the counter, and I'm looking at it, and it telepathically said to me, "It's okay." And then that's actually where that memory ends. It had done the entrainment at that point, and I don't actually remember what actually happened between us at that point, but I definitely remember this raptor type being walking into the break room and interfacing with me. Another type was a long nose gray. So it looked like a tall gray, except it had this long nose, so it actually kind of looked more like a gray skinned, like goblin-like creature. And I understood that to be a long-nosed gray, and this was absolutely a sentient organic being. I understand that there's many types of grays. Some of them are synthetic life forms or artificial life forms. This was absolutely an organic gray-like or reticulum-like being, but it actually had a long nose. And that was an extremely horrific interface experience because I mean, it communicates with you telepathically. So it's hard to describe, but you get like these downloads from it as your uh, as locks its eyes with you. You get these downloads, and you kind of feel what it's trying to convey to you. And what I got from it was its view of humanity, and it just saw us as beasts on a farm, clever animals, no different than cattle, to be used and abused, and very much kind of like this warped survival of the fittest, where it was like, if you're not, where it felt like, if we're not smart enough to assert our dominance, then they had the right to be dominant over us. It was like, the might is right kind of mentality. And it really just saw us as a food source and as a workforce, a commodity that was meant to be used and abused the same way we use and abuse cattle and livestock. And that was just a surreal moment, feeling basically just an animal, like a farm animal at that point, compared to this being's perspective. So there's a long-nosed gray. I do remember seeing small grays that were being directed by very tall Nordic-looking extraterrestrials, 7 to 8 feet tall Nordics, and they would they were telepathic. They would direct small grays with hand signals, and I feel like those small grays were robotoids. They were just robots. They weren't an organic being. They were just helpers that these Nordics would direct and use. And then there was another type, was some kind of hybrid. It was like it looked very human, but it had insectoid DNA as well. So that's a difficult one to describe, because it was even though it looked very human, the way its posture, the way it was a woman, the way she carried herself. She had like larger than normal eyes, like double the size eyes, but the way she carried herself was very primantis-like. She didn't carry herself like a normal human, the way we walk and just the way we carry ourselves. She was very very stiff and rigid, and really what acted like an insect, as bizarre as that sounds. And that was actually one of the instructors who did the orientation at the moon base, and they were trying to prep us for a more non-human looking type ET. So at the moon base, it was the Nordics and this hybrid type being, and then you got to see like some small grays, and they were kind of like prepping you for what would happen on Mars, and that was the raptor type being and the long-nosed gray, which is not very human-like compared to us at all.
So was Mars kind of a staging and training area for you for a larger Solar Warden mission? Is that what occurred, or?
Uh, the program I was in was to be like an empathic communication specialist after all the training. So that and what the Solar Warden function was to be patrolling the airspace in the solar system, like a Coast Guard on a solar system level. So like kind of like their name suggests, like being the wardens of the solar system. So my memories after the training has to do with attending conferences with various types of ETs, like I described, but mostly human personnel from different factions, with a couple ET overseers, usually the Nordics, that would run the conferences. And my job was to scan the room telepathically as an empathic, and try to feel out what the other beings and other human personnel, the feelings behind the words, because it's very easy to lie, say one thing, mean another, do another. So after the conferences, I'd be debriefed and by a commanding officer that would ask me like, so what do you think this person meant? Or do you really feel like, they're being authentic here? And it was just kind of like this empathic fail-safe and double check to make sure that these ETs and other factions were being authentic, because the ETs that are in contact with our governments are notorious liars, almost pathological liars, to a point where they're so good at it, they can look you right in the eye and tell you this whole story. And you, if you're not empathic fully, then you tend to believe them. So they can trick generals and diplomats, no problem. So they have these empathics in the background, using their ability to just kind of feel out, these ETs and other members of different, what you would call cabal factions, because everyone has their own agenda, and they're all kind of trying to cover up their own secret programs that are running in the background and their own agendas. And then once in a while, they have to pool the resources together and work together. There's an incident that happened where one of the Mars colonies was attacked by some unknown armada, and it turned out to be a reptilian subspecies that had come into our solar system and had sent all these drone-like craft, almost like I remember on this holographic view screen, where it looked like insects, almost like buzzing bees, over this base on Mars. And this base had been attacked, and but really what it was like a scouting mission, just to see what our reaction would be and what the reaction of the Nordics would be. And what happened was, in this, to make a long story short, at this conference, the Nordics forced this Mars colony and one of its affiliates to hand over some of their tech to the Solar Warden faction, so the Solar Warden faction could get upgrades that could actually stand a chance against this reptilian subspecies that had attacked. So the problem was that it's almost like in the tech sector, where Apple doesn't want to hand over its latest greatest tech to Microsoft. So even though it seemed obvious in terms of self-preservation as a human species, these are two different Mars colonies. They didn't want, these two colonies didn't want to hand over any upgrades to Solar Warden. Solar Warden, by their standards, was outdated, and they had a big problem with handing over this technology for free to Solar Warden. But eventually, the Nordics passed it through, and what happened was it was just a standoff where the Solar Warden faction got these upgrades, and they set up a blockade around this area of Mars, and this reptilian subspecies ended up backing off. And so that was just an example of how one of these conferences would go down. So I don't know, maybe I should just stop
Right.
there.
No. Thank you. Thank you. I guess there's a question that is tugging at the back of my mind, that it might be tugging at the back of people who are watching here. Did you go on the 20 years and back, and is that why you're out now?
I had the privilege of meeting with Tony Rodriguez, who talks about his 20 and back, and he also received training on Mars. And when I got to meet with him, he filled in some of the blanks for me, because I had the same question. I'm like, is it always a 20 and back? How does this 20 and back even work? Because I was still struggling to understand at the time. This was last June, so June of 2017, I met with him. And the way he explained it to me was that they create two of you, because they'll clone you, and your clone is actually the one on the second variant timeline that's doing all this. Because when they bring you back, it actually the timeline comes back together, but there is an alternate timeline of when you were taken. And I know the time travel thing is confusing, and even though he explained this to me, I still find it confusing sometimes. But they do create two of you, and that's how you can be basically two places at once. So you have this clone, Tony calls his other his clone in the program Jerry, because that's what they call him. They called him Jerry. They gave him a nickname. So he's like, so Jerry's out there, he's doing his 20 and back. But when they bring Jerry back to the point where they picked him up, that's the timeline we're on now. So they create these alternate timelines that so they're see, it gets confusing with the time travel thing. So it is you, but in an alternate timeline of when you were taken, because when they bring you back, it corrects itself as if you weren't taken. But on a deep soul level, your deep subconscious absolutely remembers this alternate timeline of when you were taken, if that makes sense.
Yeah, because the soul has those attributes. We talk about this in my book, The Omniverse, and actually you can be leading, from an incarnation point of view, you can be leading simultaneous lives as different exophenotypes in different planets, in different venues. See, that'd be that's your Kevin life in the Sol solar system that you've been dealing with, and your Kevin life soul then had that dual timeline, but you could still have your deeper soul could still be leading something in some other solar system or galaxy in this universe, or even in some other universe in this multiverse. That's how diverse this whole system is. I mean, and how versatile our deeper souls are, from my
Right.
understanding. But so now, as you understand it, I just want to pursue this line of questioning, if it's okay. As you understand it, have you been deployed and you're back? Is that it?
Uh, I wouldn't say that it's a standard 20 and back, because if
I
it's a
see.
standard 20 and back, if I was picked up in 2008, it's been 10 years. I'm only half done.
Oh, I see.
I think there's various SSP terms based
Yeah,
on what program you're put into. So it's possible my communications program as a communication specialist was a 10-year program or a
I see.
15-year program. I don't think it's just a standard 20 and back. That's like a catch-all term, I think, at this point for what we're talking about. I think a more accurate term is just SSP term. It could be, they could grad someone for 5 years or 5 months, depending on what program they're in. I mean, there's 24 roles within the secret space program. Someone I have shared recalls with, he's an ex-Marine and MMA fighter, Anthony Zender. And we had a shared recall of being aboard the TR-3 and remote viewing a submarine. And so we had this recall, and he felt that it was okay to share with me some documentation that a source of his in the military was able to sneak out off a base. And in this document, it's just 2 pages that this person was able to get out. But on page 2, it goes over 24 roles within the secret space program. And then at the bottom, it has a couple roles highlighted, and one of them is the breeder program. And in brackets, it says strong genetics. So there's people that are taken solely for cloning purposes, experimentation, that typically happens on Mars, because Mars has all these various colonies that are backed by billionaires that are able to build out on Mars and have their own research and development type corporations on Mars, where they're outside of the law from their perspective, or at least like we were talking about before, they feel like they're never going to get caught when you have an underground base on Mars. I mean, what's the average person or the average, police force really going to do if there's an underground base on Mars that's kidnapping people and experimenting on them? They're able to kind of cover their tracks. And so they have this mentality of like, if they don't get caught, then they can do whatever they want. So the thing about, sorry, I got blocked there for a second. I
Yeah,
don't know what I was getting.
yeah,
So that's
yeah.
the thing too. I'm sorry, I'm bringing all this stuff up. I apologize. My heart is racing
No,
after
no, no.
talking about those
Listen.
beings.
You're doing fine. So don't
Okay.
apologize. Yeah. Um, so so you're going through the various roles now. Um, uh, are you authorized to talk now, formally, or are you whistleblowing and going against authorization? Or did you sign any kind of a secrecy agreement that you're going against? Or are you just, hey, I'm just talking, there's no prohibition? What kind of status,
Right.
is your coming out?
I, I, I'm not like an official whistleblower that's sanctioned to talk about this. I'm one of the people that, one of the abductees that was blank slated, and but my deep subconscious started to spontaneously remember things, and apparently 5% of people that are abducted and blank slated or mind wiped, whatever you want to call it, they actually do end up getting their memories back. The blank slating eventually breaks down at some point in their life, and they spontaneously remember what happened to them. But that's only 5%. And I think the powers that be, I don't think they really have a problem with a civilian abductee um, talking about their abduction experiences when they have no military background, no real credentials, right? I'm just an abductee that happened to remember what actually happened to me. So I don't think I'm really that serious of a threat because of the giggle factor. I mean, this is such an outlandish account of what happened to me. I don't think they're worried that I'm going to tip the scale in terms of critical mass. You know what I mean? I'm not that big of a threat, and I'm really not that important. I'm just an abductee that remembers what happened to me. That's all.
Well, in the law, you're an eyewitness, And when you're sworn in before a federal court, you're testifying. And so let's go to the next slide.
Sure.
I just want to bring this in. And in the next slide, we go to June 30th, 2018. And there's the President of the United States, and there's Buzz Aldrin, who apparently he is another Mars explorer, according to some testimony. Uh, he met with Andy Basiago and Brett Stillings, two other Mars explorers. And when they were about to enroll in their Mars exploration seminars at the College of the Siskiyous in the summer of 1980s, because there were 18 people or so that were chosen for that, including a guy named Barrow Soetoro, who later would change his name in the British Columbia court to Barack Obama and become the President of the United States that came before Donald J. Trump. So this is who they also do time travel stuff on the presidents. So this is the press conference on June 30th, 2018, where the U.S. Space Force was announced with an objective of, quote, going to Mars. Now, the question is whether or not this is how many layers of plausible deniability were built into this press conference, and how many people in the press conference know that there is a long-standing, back at least to the 1960s, U.S. presence on Mars, actually U.S., Russian, British presence on Mars, uh, and but now it's official that with the U.S. Space Force. And so this is what they call in the law a defendant that you can now sue. So the planned action would in U.S. Federal Court, District of Columbia. I happen to be a member of the bar of the District of Columbia, so I'm qualified to bring the action. Although I'm not the guy that really should do it. It should be a pro bono attorney located in the District of Columbia. And it would be Mars and the Mars whistleblowers plus people like yourself versus the President of the United States, Donald J. Trump, the Department of Defense, that Donald J. Trump charged the Department of Defense with, and the U.S. Space Council, with creating the U.S. Space Force. And DARPA and the CIA used to run the 1980s CIA Mars program, which is where some of the Mars explorers used to come. But obviously now, since we have Solar Warden, we'll add Solar Warden to this. And obviously, Solar Warden is, and the Mars Colony Corporation, that was for many years headed up by the former Yale classmate of mine, Richard B. Cheney, the former vice president of the U.S. So they all become defendants. So we'll have a list of defendants as long as you're, as long as you want, and they all get served. And once you're sworn in, it becomes a federal offense to commit perjury. And they can say, well, I've signed a security oath. Well, then the judge can clear the courthouse, but so it's no big deal. But you can't commit perjury or they'll throw you in the slammer.
Right.
So what do you think about that? I mean, it looks like Donald J. Trump, he opened the whole program to a mighty lawsuit. Wouldn't you say? It looks like it.
Well, I think just on the side note, I think this recent announcement Trump talking about the U.S. Space Force, creating this new branch of the military that's going to protect American interests and American national security, but on a solar system level. I think it's actually kind of a ploy to take credit for the existing infrastructure that's already in place. The U.S. has already had its Space Force out there for many, many decades now. And so I think they're trying to do this kind of like damage control, because they know that this is trickling out. There's more and more witness testimony. There's people with actual military credentials now coming forward as well, who are very, very credible and willing to go on the record. And they know this is trickling out. So in order to kind of cover their ass, they're going to announce, which they have, this U.S. Space Force, so that even if a public sector space program like an Elon Musk, he sends his team out to Mars and they see something that's already there. They see a base. They see a white TR3 or a black TR3. What they're going to think now is, oh, that's U.S. Space Force. Oops, we shouldn't have seen that. We're technically spying on the military, spying on the U.S. So they have this like plausible deniability now because of this announcement. Whereas if Trump hadn't reiterated this U.S. Space Force, then if Elon had gone to Mars and his crew had started filming, the craft and the bases, they'd be like, "What is this? Like, why didn't you tell us about this?" But now they flipped it, so now they're gonna be like, "Oh, geez, that's the U.S. Space Force because they're actually developing that. It's top secret. We shouldn't have seen that." So they're actually gonna feel like they'll get in trouble spying on the U.S. when really, they've been there for decades.
Very grateful for your coming out today and making these statements. We look forward to your continuation in this process, both as a matter of public policy, representing Canada and Canadians who are being abducted against international law, admiralty law, common law, international humanitarian law, space law, treaty law, and this has to stop. The U.S. president has now made this secret space program public. Next step is the U.S. Federal Court, District of Columbia. So thank you very much, sir. Are there any final words or something that you had come here today that you did not have a chance to say other than what you will be saying about your timeline in the future, or a final message that you'd like to leave with our viewers until the next time that we get a chance to get together?
I think we covered it.
Yeah.
Next time we can do a part 2. I can go over my timeline in detail and we can
Great.
expand upon other points. But I think for today, that was great.
Good enough then. Well, thank you very much. We've been with Kevin Trimmel, and he's a secret space program, veteran and survivor and abductee, and now a civilian whistleblower, I would say. And we feel very privileged and honored to have him join us today. I'm Alfred Lambremont Webre. This is TrueTube.co, Exopolitics TV, NewsInsideOut.com. Thank you for joining us.